The courthouse steps felt cold beneath my feet as I watched Marcus emerge from the building, his face ashen, his expensive suit wrinkled from a night spent in a holding cell. The judge had just granted my restraining order, 3 years of careful documentation, of quietly saving evidence, of enduring his gaslighting while methodically building my case. It all culminated in this moment. He looked up and saw me standing there, and for the first time in our 5-year relationship, I saw genuine fear flicker across his features. "Sarah!" he called out, his voice carrying that familiar tone of wounded confusion he'd perfected. "Sarah, please, we can work this out." I said nothing. I simply turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the concrete with mechanical precision. Behind me, I could hear him calling my name, growing more desperate with each syllable. The sound no longer had the power to make me turn back. That wasn't always the case. It began innocuously enough, as these things always do. Marcus and I met at a medical conference 3 years into my psychiatric residency. He was a pharmaceutical sales representative, charming and confident, with an easy smile that seemed to light up every room he entered. During our first conversation over lukewarm conference coffee, he listened intently as I discussed my research on anxiety disorders, nodding at all the right moments, asking thoughtful questions that made me feel seen and understood. "You're brilliant," he said, and the compliment felt like warm honey after years of grinding through medical school where every achievement was met with the expectation of 10 more. Most people don't have the emotional intelligence to work in psychiatry. It takes someone really special. Looking back, I can see how expertly he played to my insecurities. I was 28, exhausted from years of medical training, and desperately seeking validation that I was on the right path. Marcus provided that validation in abundance, at least initially. Our early dates were perfect in their intensity. He would show up at the hospital after my 14-hour shifts with Thai food and my favorite wine, insisting I was working too hard, that I deserved to be taken care of. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by my research deadlines, he would massage my shoulders and remind me that I was the smartest person he knew. When I complained about difficult attending physicians, he would hold me while I cried and tell me they were just threatened by my potential. "You're too good for that place," became his frequent refrain. "They don't appreciate what they have." 6 months into our relationship, I moved in with him. It seemed logical. My resident salary was laughable, and his pharmaceutical sales income afforded us a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in the city's medical district. More importantly, I was falling in love with the version of myself I saw reflected in his eyes. Brilliant, beautiful, deserving of devotion. The changes started subtly. Small comments that felt like gentle corrections rather than criticisms. When I would get excited about a breakthrough in my research, he would listen with what seemed like patient attention before suggesting I was perhaps overthinking things. When I would share frustrations about hospital politics, he would agree that my colleagues were difficult, but maybe I was being a little too sensitive about their comments. "You have such a big heart," he would say, stroking my hair. "Sometimes I think you take things too personally." The phrase "too personally" became a frequent addition to our conversations. My reaction to a professor's harsh critique of my presentation was too personal. My frustration when he canceled our dinner plans for the 3rd time that month was too personal. My hurt when he forgot my birthday was definitely too personal. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill," he would say with that same gentle smile, and I would find myself apologizing for my emotional reactions, trying to be more understanding, more flexible, more worthy of his patience. The isolation happened gradually. Marcus never explicitly forbade me from seeing friends or family, but he had an uncanny ability to schedule romantic dinners or weekend getaways whenever I had plans with others. When my medical school friends would invite me out, he would remind me how tired I looked, how much I needed rest, how much more fun we could have together at home. When my sister called for our weekly check-ins, he would hover nearby, listening to my side of the conversation with an expression of barely concealed irritation. "Your family is so demanding," he would say afterward. "Don't they realize how hard you work? How little time we get together?" Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my world began to shrink. The friends who had once been my support system grew distant, tired of canceled plans and increasingly brief text responses. My family started calling less frequently, interpreting my distraction during our conversations as disinterest rather than the careful monitoring I'd learned to perform whenever Marcus was within earshot. But it was during my fourth year of residency that Marcus's manipulation took on a more sinister quality. I had been selected to present my research at a national psychiatric conference, a tremendous honor that could significantly impact my career trajectory. I was excited, nervous, and proud in equal measure. When I shared the news with Marcus, his initial response seemed supportive. "That's wonderful, baby," he said, kissing my forehead. "Though I have to say, you've been so stressed lately with all this work pressure. Are you sure you're ready for something this high profile?" The comment lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. Was I too stressed? Had my excitement blinded me to my own limitations? I pushed the doubts aside and threw myself into preparation, working late into the night to perfect my presentation. Marcus began to comment more frequently on my mental state. I was manic when I talked enthusiastically about my research. I was paranoid when I worried about the presentation's reception. I was spiraling when I stayed up late working on slides. Each label was delivered with apparent concern, accompanied by suggestions that perhaps I should talk to someone, that maybe I was pushing myself too hard, that people in our field were notorious for developing the very conditions they studied. "I'm just worried about you," he would say, pulling me close. "You know I love you, right? I just want you to be healthy." The gaslighting was so expertly executed that I began to question my own perceptions. Was I being manic? Was my passion for my work actually a symptom of instability? Marcus had been around the medical field long enough to speak the language convincingly, dropping terms like hypomanic episodes and imposter syndrome into casual conversation. 2 weeks before the conference, I made the mistake of confiding in Marcus about a panic attack I'd experienced after a particularly difficult patient session. Instead of offering comfort, he launched into a concerned monologue about how the stress was clearly affecting my mental health, how maybe I should consider withdrawing from the conference, how pushing myself when I was clearly struggling could have serious consequences for my career. "What if you have a breakdown during your presentation?" he asked, his voice heavy with apparent worry. "What if this is too much pressure? I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because I didn't speak up." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with doubts. Was he right? Was I on the verge of some kind of breakdown? The panic attack had been terrifying. What if it happened again in front of hundreds of my colleagues? What if Marcus was the only one who could see clearly how unstable I'd become? By morning, I had convinced myself to withdraw from the conference. When I called Dr. Patterson, my research supervisor, to deliver the news, her response was immediate and sharp. "Sarah, this is completely unlike you. You've been preparing for months. Your research is groundbreaking. What's really going on?" I found myself parroting Marcus's concerns about my mental health, about not wanting to risk embarrassing myself or the department. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah," Dr. Patterson said carefully, "I've worked with you for 4 years. You're one of the most stable, brilliant residents I've ever supervised. These concerns you're expressing, they don't align with anything I've observed. Is everything okay at home?" The question hit me like a physical blow. For just a moment, the fog of confusion lifted, and I saw my situation with crystalline clarity. Marcus's campaign of psychological manipulation, disguised as concern, had been so thorough that I was actively sabotaging my own career based on his assessment of my mental state. But the moment passed quickly. That evening, when I told Marcus I'd withdrawn from the conference, his relief was palpable. He held me close and told me how proud he was of me for making such a mature decision, how it showed real self-awareness and emotional intelligence. His validation felt like absolution, confirmation that I'd made the right choice. Dr. Patterson tried to change my mind several times over the following week, but I held firm. The conference came and went. Dr. Rodriguez from Johns Hopkins presented research remarkably similar to mine and received a standing ovation. The opportunity I'd spent 4 years building toward disappeared, and with it, my confidence in my own professional judgment. Marcus's sabotage of my career became a pattern. When I was offered a prestigious fellowship, he reminded me of how fragile I'd been recently, how moving to a new city might be too stressful. When I received positive feedback from attending physicians, he would smile and nod while subtly suggesting that they were probably just being nice, that I shouldn't let it go to my head. When I struggled with particularly difficult cases, he would comfort me by suggesting that maybe I wasn't cut out for such a demanding specialty, that there was no shame in considering something less stressful. "I just want you to be happy," he would say, stroking my hair as I cried over another missed opportunity. "You put so much pressure on yourself. Maybe you'd be happier in a less competitive field." The most insidious part of his manipulation was how he positioned himself as my protector. When I would express frustration about feeling stuck in my career, he would remind me of all the times he'd saved me from making decisions that would have been too stressful or too ambitious for my fragile mental state. When I would question whether I was really as unstable as he suggested, he would pull out his phone and show me text messages I'd sent during moments of anxiety, pointing out how erratic and concerning my thought patterns had become. "Look at this," he would say, scrolling through a particularly emotional text I'd sent after a difficult day. "Does this seem like the writing of someone who's thinking clearly? I'm not trying to hurt you, Sarah. I'm trying to help you see what I see." The evidence was damning because it was real. I had sent those texts. I had experienced those moments of doubt and anxiety. What Marcus conveniently omitted was the context, that these moments invariably followed his systematic undermining of my confidence, that my anxiety spiked specifically after conversations with him about my supposed mental instability. By my 5th year of residency, I had become a shadow of my former self. The ambitious, confident woman who had matched into one of the most competitive psychiatric residency programs in the country had been replaced by someone who second-guessed every decision, who constantly monitored her own emotions for signs of the instability her boyfriend insisted was lurking just beneath the surface. My performance evaluations reflected this transformation. Attending physicians noted that I seemed hesitant, that my confidence had diminished, that I appeared to be struggling with self-doubt. These observations, when shared with Marcus, became further evidence of my declining mental health, rather than the natural result of years of psychological manipulation. "See," he would say, reading over my evaluations with apparent sadness, "even they can see you're struggling. Maybe it's time to consider that fellowship in family medicine we talked about, something less demanding." The tragedy was that I genuinely believed he loved me, even as he systematically destroyed my confidence and sabotaged my career. I interpreted his actions as those of a devoted partner trying to protect me from my own self-destructive tendencies. The version of reality he had constructed was so complete, so consistent, that questioning it felt like questioning my own sanity. But Marcus made one crucial error in his campaign of psychological control. He began to extend his narrative beyond our private relationship. It started with small comments to mutual acquaintances. When we would run into colleagues at medical events, Marcus would make casual remarks about how hard I'd been working, how stressed I'd seemed lately, how worried he was about my mental health. He would deliver these comments with apparent love and concern, positioning himself as the devoted boyfriend caring for his struggling partner. "Sarah's been going through a really rough patch," he would say to Dr. Williams from the neurology department, his hand resting protectively on my back. "I keep telling her she needs to take better care of herself, but you know how these psychiatrists are. They're the worst at following their own advice." The comments were always delivered with a laugh, a knowing look, a suggestion that my struggles were an open secret, that everyone could see but nobody wanted to address directly. Colleagues began to look at me with a mixture of pity and concern. Conversations became stilted, careful, as if everyone was walking on eggshells around my supposed fragility. Marcus began to share more specific details about my mental state with our social circle. He would tell people about my panic attacks, my insomnia, my moments of self-doubt, always framing himself as the patient partner dealing with an increasingly unstable girlfriend. He spoke about my episodes and my manic phases with the casual expertise of someone fluent in psychiatric terminology, lending credibility to his assessments. "I'm really worried about her," he confided to Janet, a nurse practitioner we'd known for years. "She's been having these mood swings, staying up all night working on research projects that don't make any sense. Yesterday, she spent 6 hours rearranging her notes because she was convinced there was some pattern she was missing. I don't know what to do." The stories were based on kernels of truth but twisted into evidence of mental instability. Yes, I had spent hours reorganizing my research notes, because I was preparing for a presentation and wanted everything to be perfect. Yes, I had experienced mood swings, primarily in response to his constant undermining of my self-worth. Yes, I had trouble sleeping, often because I would lie awake questioning my own perceptions and wondering if I was really as unstable as he suggested. Marcus's campaign was so effective that people began to approach me with gentle suggestions about seeking help. Janet mentioned that she knew a good therapist. Dr. Chen from the emergency department asked if I was taking care of myself. Even the hospital chaplain, who barely knew me, stopped by my office one day to check on my well-being. Each well-meaning intervention felt like confirmation that Marcus was right, that my mental state was so obviously deteriorated that even casual acquaintances could see it. I began to withdraw further, avoiding social situations where people might observe my supposed instability, speaking less in meetings to avoid saying something that might be interpreted as evidence of my psychological decline. But Marcus's need for control, his desire to position himself as the long-suffering partner of a mentally ill woman, ultimately led to his downfall. Because the more he spread his narrative about my instability, the more specific and verifiable his claims became. And the more specific his claims became, the easier they were to document and ultimately to disprove. The catalyst came on a Tuesday evening in March. I had been working late in the hospital library, reviewing case files for a presentation I was scheduled to give the following week. It was nearly 9 o'clock when I finally gathered my materials and headed for the parking garage. As I approached my car, I could hear voices echoing off the concrete walls. "Honestly, don't know how much more I can take," Marcus was saying. I froze, recognizing his voice immediately. He was standing near the elevator bank with Dr. Harrison, the chief of psychiatry. "It's got to be incredibly difficult," Dr. Harrison replied, his voice heavy with sympathy. "How long has she been like this?" "About 2 years now," Marcus said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, an exhaustion that seemed genuine, carefully cultivated. At first, I thought it was just the stress of residency. But it's gotten so much worse, the paranoia, the mood swings, the complete inability to maintain relationships. She's alienated everyone who cares about her. I pressed myself against a concrete pillar, my heart hammering in my chest. They were talking about me. Marcus was telling the chief of my department, my boss, the man who would determine my future in psychiatry, that I was mentally unstable. "Has she been evaluated?" Dr. Harrison asked. "I've tried to bring it up, but you know how it is. She's convinced that everyone else is the problem. Last week, she accused me of deliberately sabotaging her career because I suggested she might want to reconsider that fellowship application. She said I was gaslighting her." Marcus laughed, but it was a hollow sound. It's textbook projection, really. She's so deep in her delusions that she can't see how her own behavior is the real problem. "The irony of psychiatrists who can't recognize their own mental health issues," Dr. Harrison said with a sigh. "It's more common than people realize. Have you considered staging an intervention? Sometimes it takes a coordinated effort from multiple people to break through that kind of denial." "I've thought about it," Marcus replied. "But honestly, I'm not sure I can handle much more of this. The other night, she had a complete meltdown because I forgot to pick up her prescription. She was screaming about how I was trying to sabotage her health, how I was deliberately keeping her unstable. It was frightening, actually. I've started wondering if she might be dangerous." The words hit me like physical blows. Dangerous, delusional, unstable. Marcus was painting a picture of me as a volatile, paranoid woman on the verge of a complete psychological breakdown, and he was doing it to the one person whose opinion could end my career before it truly began. But even as I stood there, trembling with rage and disbelief, a part of my mind began to work with the clinical precision I'd been trained to employ. Because Marcus had made specific claims about specific incidents, and I knew with absolute certainty that at least one of them was completely fabricated. The prescription incident he described had never happened. I didn't take any regular medications, and I certainly hadn't had a meltdown about a forgotten prescription. Marcus had just told a detailed, specific lie to my department chief, and he'd told it with such conviction that Dr. Harrison clearly believed every word. If he had lied about that incident, what else had he lied about? And more importantly, how many other lies had he told? To how many other people about my mental state? For the first time in years, I felt a cold, clear fury cut through the fog of self-doubt that had surrounded me. Marcus had spent so long convincing me that I couldn't trust my own perceptions that I'd stopped trusting them entirely. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that the prescription incident was fabricated, which meant that my perceptions weren't flawed. Marcus's narrative was. I waited until their conversation ended and they disappeared into the elevator before I moved. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my car, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. If Marcus was lying about specific incidents, then I needed to document everything. I needed proof. That night, I went home and pretended everything was normal. Marcus greeted me with his usual concerned smile, asking about my day, commenting on how tired I looked. But instead of absorbing his observations as objective assessments of my deteriorating mental state, I began to listen to them as performance pieces, carefully crafted to reinforce a narrative that served his needs rather than reflected reality. "You seem agitated," he said, as I moved around the kitchen preparing a late dinner. "Did something happen at work?" In the past, this comment would have made me pause and examine my behavior, wondering if I was indeed displaying signs of agitation that I wasn't aware of. But tonight, I realized that I felt calm. Focused, actually, in a way I hadn't felt in years. Marcus was trying to create agitation where none existed. "I'm fine," I said simply. "Are you sure? You're moving around pretty frantically. And you didn't respond to my text today." Another lie. I had responded to his texts, brief, polite responses to his check-ins about my schedule and dinner plans. But Marcus was rewriting recent history, creating evidence of erratic behavior that hadn't actually occurred. "I responded to your text," I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling through our conversation. "See? I answered about dinner at 2:30 and about whether I needed anything from the store at 4:15. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across Marcus's face. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. But his recovery was smooth and practiced. "Oh, you're right," he said with a self-deprecating laugh. "I guess I was thinking about yesterday. You've been so overwhelmed lately that sometimes the days blur together for me too. But I hadn't been overwhelmed yesterday either, and I was certain I'd responded to his text then as well. And Marcus was creating a pattern of non-responsiveness that didn't exist, building evidence for the narrative he'd been spreading about my deteriorating mental state. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, I sat in our home office and began to write. I documented every conversation I could remember from the past week, every comment he'd made about my mental state, every incident he'd referenced as evidence of my instability. Then, I began cross-referencing his claims with objective evidence, text messages, emails, calendar entries, anything that could verify or contradict his version of events. The pattern that emerged was staggering in its scope and systematic nature. Marcus had been lying about specific incidents for months, possibly years. Small lies, mostly, designed to support his overarching narrative about my psychological decline. But lies nonetheless, and lies told with such consistency and conviction that I'd accepted them as truth. More importantly, I realized that if he was lying to me about our interactions, he was almost certainly lying to others as well. The conversation I'd overheard in the parking garage wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a deliberate campaign to destroy my professional reputation by convincing my colleagues that I was mentally unstable. Over the following week, I began to pay careful attention to Marcus's behavior in social situations. I watched him position himself as my concerned caregiver, making subtle comments about my stress levels, my sleep patterns, my emotional stability. I observed how he would share intimate details about my supposed struggles with people who barely knew me, always framing his revelations as reluctant admissions from a devoted partner who was running out of options. But now that I was watching for it, I could see the performance in his concern. The way he would glance around to make sure he had an audience before launching into a description of my latest episode. The way he would lower his voice conspiratorially when sharing details about my mental health, creating an atmosphere of intimate revelation that made his listeners feel privileged to receive such sensitive information. Most tellingly, I noticed that his stories about my behavior were often inconsistent. He would tell Janet that I'd been having insomnia, then tell Dr. Williams that I'd been sleeping too much. He would describe me as manic and energetic to one person, then as depressed and withdrawn to another. The contradictions suggested that Marcus wasn't reporting actual observations of my behavior. He was crafting different versions of my instability for different audiences, tailoring his narrative to achieve maximum impact with each individual. Armed with this understanding, I began to do something I hadn't done in years. I started documenting my own reality. I kept a detailed journal of my daily activities, my mood, my interactions with others. I saved screenshots of text conversations. I began recording my interactions with Marcus using a small digital recorder I purchased and kept hidden in my pocket. The recordings were revelatory. When I listened back to our conversations, I could hear the subtle ways Marcus would distort our interactions, introducing doubt and confusion where none had existed. He would ask me about events that had never happened, then express concern when I couldn't remember them. He would reference conversations that had never taken place, then suggest that my inability to recall them was evidence of my deteriorating memory. "Remember last Tuesday when you called me crying from the hospital bathroom?" he asked one evening. "I didn't call you from any bathroom last Tuesday," I replied, certain of my facts because I'd been meticulously documenting my activities. "Sarah, you were sobbing. You said Dr. Patterson had humiliated you in front of the residents and you couldn't stop crying. I talked you through it for 20 minutes. I pulled out my phone and checked my call log. There was no record of any call to Marcus from the hospital last Tuesday. I'd worked a standard shift, attended rounds, had a perfectly normal day. "There's no record of that call," I said, showing him my phone. Marcus looked at the screen with apparent confusion, then his expression shifted to one of gentle concern. "Honey," he said softly, "just because you deleted the call log doesn't mean it didn't happen. You've been doing that lately, erasing things when you're embarrassed about your emotional reactions. It's okay, I'm not judging you, but maybe this is something we should talk to someone about." The accusation was breathtaking in its audacity. Not only was Marcus insisting that a fictional conversation had taken place, but he was now suggesting that I was actively deleting evidence of my own instability. He was creating a scenario where any absence of evidence became proof of my delusional behavior. But I had been recording our conversations, and I had proof that this gaslighting attempt had occurred. For the first time in years, I had objective evidence that my perceptions were accurate and Marcus's were false. The decision to expose Marcus's lies wasn't born of anger, though anger certainly played a role. It was born of the crystalline clarity that comes when you finally understand the true nature of the game being played against you. Marcus had constructed an elaborate fiction about my mental state, and he'd been using that fiction to isolate me professionally and personally while positioning himself as my heroic caregiver. But fiction, no matter how skillfully constructed, has a fundamental weakness. It's not real, and reality leaves traces. I began my investigation methodically, approaching it with the same systematic precision I'd learned to apply to psychiatric diagnoses. If Marcus was spreading lies about my mental health, those lies would be documented somewhere. People would have records of conversations, emails, text messages. They would remember specific incidents he'd described, specific claims he'd made. My first step was to reach out to Dr. Patterson, my research supervisor. I scheduled a meeting under the pretext of discussing my career trajectory, but I had a more specific agenda in mind. "Dr. Patterson," I said, after we'd covered the preliminary topics, "I wanted to ask you about something. Has Marcus ever spoken to you about concerns regarding my mental health?" Dr. Patterson's expression shifted immediately, becoming guarded and uncomfortable. "Sarah, if you're having concerns about your relationship dynamics, that's really something you should discuss with a therapist, not with me." "I'm not asking for relationship advice," I clarified. "I'm asking specifically whether Marcus has made claims about my psychological stability to you or to other members of the department." The question hung in the air between us. Dr. Patterson was clearly uncomfortable, but she was also a physician bound by certain ethical obligations. "I think," she said carefully, "that there may have been some conversations that you should be aware of, but I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue." "Dr. Patterson," I interrupted, "has Marcus told people in this department that I'm mentally unstable? Has he shared specific incidents or symptoms that he claims to have observed?" The directness of my question seemed to surprise her. After a long pause, she nodded. Yes, she said quietly. There have been conversations. Marcus has expressed concerns about your psychological well being to several faculty members. He's described specific incidents: panic attacks, mood swings, paranoid ideation. He's suggested that you might be developing a psychiatric condition, but are too deep in denial to seek treatment. The confirmation was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant that Marcus's campaign against my reputation was even more extensive than I'd realized. Liberating because it gave me a concrete starting point for my investigation. Can you tell me specifically what incidents he's described? I asked. Dr. Patterson looked deeply uncomfortable, but she seemed to recognize the gravity of the situation. He's mentioned several episodes where you've had what he called paranoid meltdowns about people trying to sabotage your career. He described a night when you apparently barricaded yourself in your apartment because you were convinced that your neighbors were monitoring your activities. He said, you've been staying up for days at a time, working on research projects that don't make logical sense, then crashing into depressive episodes where you can't get out of bed. Every single incident she described was completely fabricated. I had never barricaded myself in my apartment, never stayed awake for days working on nonsensical projects, never had paranoid episodes about my neighbors. Marcus had created an elaborate psychiatric history for me, complete with specific symptoms and progressive deterioration. Dr. Patterson, I said, choosing my words carefully. None of those incidents actually occurred. Marcus has been systematically lying about my mental health to members of this department. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Patterson stared at me with a mixture of shock and growing understanding. Sarah, she said finally, if what you're saying is true, this is an extraordinarily serious situation. Marcus isn't just spreading rumors. He's actively attempting to damage your professional reputation by making false claims about your psychological fitness to practice medicine. I know, I said, and I intend to prove it. Over the following weeks, I conducted similar conversations with other faculty members, always approaching the topic with careful clinical neutrality. The picture that emerged was comprehensive and damning. Marcus had spent the better part of 2 years constructing an alternate reality in which I was a deeply troubled individual whose mental health was deteriorating rapidly. He had told Dr. Williams that I'd been hearing voices during patient sessions. He had informed Dr. Chen that I'd been exhibiting symptoms of bipolar disorder with dramatic mood swings that made me unsuitable for patient care. He had confided to the department secretary that he was considering having me involuntarily committed because I was becoming a danger to myself and others. Every single claim was not only false, but verifiably false. I had documentation proving that I'd been at work during times when Marcus claimed I was having psychiatric episodes. I had witnesses who could attest to my normal behavior during periods when Marcus described me as being in acute psychological distress. But the most damning evidence came from Marcus himself. Because I had been recording our conversations for several weeks, I had documentation of him creating lies in real time. I had recordings of him describing incidents that had never happened, referencing conversations that had never taken place, and gaslighting me when I contradicted his false narratives. The prescription incident he'd described to Dr. Harrison was just one example. I had recordings of Marcus fabricating at least a dozen similar stories, each designed to support his overarching narrative about my mental instability. More importantly, I had evidence of him coaching himself on these lies, rehearsing the details to ensure they sounded convincing. In one particularly revealing recording, I captured Marcus practicing a conversation he planned to have with Dr. Harrison about my supposed deterioration. "She's been getting worse lately," he said to himself, apparently unaware that I was in the next room with my recorder running. "Last week, she had a complete breakdown in the hospital cafeteria. Started screaming about how everyone was conspiring against her. Security had to escort her out." The incident he was describing had never happened. I had never had a breakdown in the cafeteria, never been escorted out by security, never exhibited any of the behaviors he was planning to report. But Marcus was rehearsing the story with the same attention to detail that an actor might use to prepare for a performance. Armed with this evidence, I began the careful process of documenting everything. I created a comprehensive timeline of Marcus's lies, cross-referenced with objective evidence that contradicted his claims. I compiled recordings of his gaslighting attempts, his fabricated stories, and his practice sessions for conversations with my colleagues. But I didn't move immediately to expose him. Instead, I began to plan my response with the same systematic precision that Marcus had used to construct his campaign against me. If I was going to destroy his credibility, I needed to do it in a way that would be complete and irreversible. I started by quietly correcting the record with individual faculty members. I would approach each person who had received false information from Marcus and provide them with objective evidence that contradicted his claims. I showed Dr. Williams my hospital ID badge records, proving that I'd been at work during times when Marcus claimed I was having psychiatric episodes at home. I provided Dr. Chen with phone records demonstrating that the paranoid calls Marcus described me making had never actually occurred. The effect was immediate and powerful. One by one, my colleagues began to understand that they had been manipulated. The concerned, caring boyfriend who had been sharing intimate details about his girlfriend's mental health struggles was revealed to be a calculating liar who had been systematically destroying my reputation for his own psychological gratification. Dr. Patterson was particularly helpful in this process. Once she understood the scope of Marcus's deception, she became an ally in correcting the false narrative he had spread about me. She reached out to other faculty members, sharing the evidence I had provided and encouraging them to reconsider their assumptions about my mental health. "I feel sick about this," she told me during one of our meetings. "Marcus was so convincing, so detailed in his descriptions. He seemed genuinely concerned and heartbroken about your condition. I never thought to question whether he might be lying about something so serious." But correcting the professional damage was only part of my plan. I also began to document the personal toll of Marcus's campaign. I reached out to friends who had distanced themselves from me over the past 2 years, explaining that Marcus had been spreading false information about my mental health. Many of them had received direct communications from him, describing my supposed psychiatric symptoms and asking for their help and encouraging me to seek treatment. Janet, the nurse practitioner who had suggested I see a therapist, was horrified when I played her recordings of Marcus fabricating the stories he had told her about my behavior. "He seems so worried about you," she said, her voice shaking with anger. He described these specific incidents, times when you'd called him in the middle of the night having panic attacks, episodes where you'd become convinced that your patients were plotting against you. He even showed me text messages that he said you'd sent during manic episodes. The text messages were particularly interesting evidence of Marcus's deception. Because I had been meticulously documenting my communications, I was able to prove that the messages he had shown to Janet had been fabricated. The timestamps were wrong, the language was inconsistent with my writing style, and, most tellingly, there was no record of them in my phone's memory. Marcus had been creating false text messages to support his lies about my mental state. He had been manufacturing evidence of my instability and sharing it with people in my professional and personal networks to corroborate his claims. The scope of his deception was staggering. Over the course of 2 years, Marcus had constructed an entire alternate reality in which I was a deeply troubled individual whose mental health was deteriorating rapidly. He had created false incidents, fabricated symptoms, and manufactured evidence to support his narrative. He had shared this fictional version of my mental state with dozens of people, positioning himself as my heroic caregiver while systematically destroying my reputation and isolating me from my support systems. But the most insidious aspect of his campaign was how he had used my own profession against me. Marcus understood psychiatric terminology and diagnostic criteria well enough to make his lies sound clinically credible. He had weaponized the stigma surrounding mental health issues, knowing that people would be reluctant to question his claims for fear of seeming insensitive or judgmental. As I continued to gather evidence and correct the false narrative, I began to understand the full scope of the psychological abuse I had endured. Marcus hadn't just been gaslighting me about my mental state. He had been conducting a systematic campaign to convince everyone in my life that I was mentally unstable, while simultaneously working to make me actually become unstable through his manipulation. It was a closed loop of abuse. The more he undermined my confidence and isolated me from support systems, the more fragile and uncertain I became. The more fragile I became, the more credible his claims about my mental instability appeared to outside observers, and the more people believed his lies, the more isolated and doubting I became. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his campaign. He had told too many specific lies to too many people, and those lies were verifiable. Fiction, no matter how skillfully constructed, cannot withstand systematic scrutiny when compared to objective reality. 3 months into my investigation, I received an unexpected ally in the form of Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in cases involving psychological manipulation and abuse. Dr. Patterson had referred me to her after I shared the recordings and documentation I had compiled. This is one of the most comprehensive cases of systematic psychological abuse I've ever seen, Dr. Chen told me after reviewing my evidence. Marcus hasn't just been gaslighting you. He's been conducting what we call a proxy abuse campaign, using your professional community as unwitting accomplices in his psychological manipulation. Dr. Chen explained that what Marcus had done was particularly insidious because he had weaponized the medical community's legitimate concern for practitioners' mental health. Healthcare professionals are trained to watch for signs of burnout, depression, and other psychological issues among their colleagues. Marcus had exploited this professional vigilance by providing false information that triggered appropriate concern responses from people who genuinely cared about my well-being. He's essentially been running a long-term psychological warfare campaign, Dr. Chen continued. The goal wasn't just to control you, it was to completely destroy your sense of reality and your professional identity while positioning himself as your savior. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my experience was part of a recognized pattern of abuse that forensic psychologists had begun to document and study. She connected me with other professionals who had experienced similar campaigns of systematic psychological manipulation, and their stories helped me understand that I wasn't alone in having endured this type of abuse. But more importantly, Dr. Chen helped me recognize that the careful documentation I had been compiling wasn't just evidence of Marcus's deception, it was evidence of a potentially criminal pattern of behavior. In some jurisdictions, the systematic spread of false information designed to damage someone's professional reputation could constitute criminal defamation. The psychological manipulation I had endured might qualify as criminal harassment. You have options, Dr. Chen told me. You can pursue civil remedies for the damage to your reputation and career. You may have grounds for criminal charges related to harassment and defamation. And you certainly have the right to expose his behavior to protect other potential victims. The word victims hit me like a physical blow. In all my focus on documenting Marcus's lies and correcting the false narrative he had spread about me, I hadn't considered the possibility that I might not be his only target. But Dr. Chen was right. Someone capable of conducting such a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation was unlikely to limit his behavior to a single relationship. Have you looked into his past relationships? Dr. Chen asked. Has he ever mentioned ex-girlfriends who were crazy or unstable? Partners who had mental health issues that ended their relationships? The question triggered a flood of memories. Marcus had indeed mentioned several ex-girlfriends who had been troubled. There was Jessica, who had supposedly been bipolar and unstable. There was Amanda, who had allegedly been paranoid and possessive. There was Lisa, who had apparently been so depressed that she couldn't maintain a job or relationship. At the time, these stories had seemed like unfortunate histories that demonstrated Marcus's patience and compassion for troubled women. But now, viewed through the lens of what I knew about his capacity for systematic deception, they took on a much more sinister cast. I told Dr. Chen, that I need to do some additional research. Finding Marcus's ex-girlfriends required some detective work, but social media and professional networks made it easier than it might have been in previous decades. I started with the names he had mentioned, cross-referencing them with his social media history and mutual acquaintances. Jessica turned out to be Dr. Jessica Martinez, a family medicine physician practicing in Seattle. When I reached out to her through professional channels, explaining that I was investigating concerning behavior by Marcus and asking if she'd be willing to speak with me, her response was immediate and intense. "Oh my God," she said during our phone conversation. "I can't believe someone else went through this. I thought I was the only one." Jessica's story was remarkably similar to mine. Marcus had spent the better part of their 2-year relationship convincing her that she was mentally unstable, sharing fabricated stories about her behavior with her colleagues, and systematically undermining her confidence and professional reputation. He told everyone at my residency program that I was bipolar, Jessica told me. He would make up these elaborate stories about manic episodes I'd supposedly had, complete with specific details about things I'd allegedly said or done. I started to believe him because he was so convincing, and because other people started treating me like I was fragile and unpredictable. Jessica had eventually ended the relationship when she caught Marcus in a particularly egregious lie. He had told her department chief that she had been hospitalized for a psychiatric emergency when she had actually been visiting her family for a holiday. But the damage to her reputation had been severe enough that she had ultimately left her residency program and moved across the country to escape the false narrative he had created about her mental health. I've spent the last 3 years rebuilding my career, Jessica said. But the worst part was how he made me doubt my own sanity. Even now, sometimes I wonder if some of the things he said about me were true. Amanda's story was similar, though she had left medicine entirely after Marcus's campaign against her reputation made it impossible for her to continue her career as a surgical resident. Lisa had moved to another state and changed her specialty after Marcus convinced her colleagues that she was too unstable to handle the demands of emergency medicine. Each conversation was both heartbreaking and validating. Marcus had a clear pattern of targeting ambitious, successful women in medical fields, systematically destroying their confidence and professional reputations while positioning himself as their devoted caregiver. He was predatory in his selection of victims, choosing women who were isolated by demanding training programs and vulnerable to manipulation due to the inherent stresses of medical education. But each conversation also provided additional evidence of Marcus's systematic deception. The stories he had told me about his ex-girlfriend's mental health issues were largely fabricated, just like the stories he had been telling others about mine. He had created fictional psychiatric histories for multiple partners, then used those histories to justify the end of relationships and garner sympathy from new victims. Most importantly, the pattern of behavior was consistent across multiple relationships spanning several years. This wasn't a case of a relationship gone wrong or a partner who had gradually become manipulative. Marcus was engaging in deliberate, systematic psychological abuse with the clear intent of damaging his victim's mental health and professional standing. Dr. Chen was right. I wasn't just dealing with a manipulative ex-boyfriend. I was dealing with a serial psychological abuser who had been perfecting his techniques across multiple victims over many years. The decision to pursue formal consequences for Marcus's behavior wasn't driven by revenge, though I won't pretend that vindication didn't play a role. It was driven by the recognition that his pattern of behavior was criminal, that he had caused measurable harm to multiple victims, and that he would continue to cause harm until he faced meaningful consequences. With Dr. Chen's help, I compiled a comprehensive legal case documenting Marcus's campaign of defamation and psychological abuse. The evidence was overwhelming. Recordings of him fabricating stories, documentation of the false narratives he had spread about my mental health, testimony from colleagues who had received his fabricated reports, and evidence of the professional damage his lies had caused. But the most powerful evidence came from his other victims. Jessica, Amanda, and Lisa all agreed to provide testimony about their experiences with Marcus. Together, we could demonstrate a clear pattern of predatory behavior spanning multiple years and multiple victims. The civil case for defamation was straightforward. Marcus had made specific false claims about my mental health to members of my professional community, and those false claims had caused measurable damage to my career prospects. I had documentation of missed opportunities, negative performance evaluations that resulted from his lies, and professional relationships that had been damaged by his fabricated narratives. But Dr. Chen also helped me understand that Marcus's behavior might constitute criminal harassment or stalking. The systematic campaign he had conducted against my reputation, combined with his deliberate attempts to isolate me and undermine my mental health, could be prosecuted under laws designed to protect victims of psychological abuse. The process of pursuing legal remedies was lengthy and emotionally challenging. I had to relive the details of Marcus's manipulation repeatedly, providing testimony about the most vulnerable moments of our relationship and the systematic ways he had undermined my sense of reality. But I also had the support of an amazing legal team, led by an attorney who specialized in cases involving psychological abuse and defamation. Sarah Williams, ESQ Ty, understood the complex dynamics of the case and the importance of holding Marcus accountable not just for the damage he had caused me, but for the pattern of abuse he had inflicted on multiple victims. Cases like this are important, Sarah told me during one of our preparation sessions. Psychological abuse is often dismissed as a civil matter or a relationship issue. But what Marcus did crosses the line into criminal behavior. He engaged in systematic defamation with the intent to destroy your professional reputation and mental health. That's not just abusive, it's criminal. The confrontation I had been anticipating for months finally came in the form of a legal summons. Marcus was served with papers for both the civil defamation case and criminal charges related to harassment and stalking. His initial response was predictably manipulative. He called me repeatedly, alternating between anger and apparent heartbreak, insisting that I was having a psychotic break, and that legal action was evidence of my deteriorating mental state. But I no longer had any doubt about my perceptions or my judgment. The evidence of his lies was overwhelming, and I had the support of multiple professionals who could attest to both my mental stability and the systematic nature of his abuse. Marcus's attempts to continue his gaslighting campaign actually worked in my favor. Because I was still recording our interactions, I was able to document his efforts to manipulate me even after being served with legal papers. In one particularly damning recording, he threatened to tell the court that I was too mentally unstable to be trusted as a reliable witness. "Sarah, you know you're not thinking clearly right now," he said during one of his phone calls. "This whole legal thing is just proof that you're having a breakdown. I'll have to tell them about your history, about all the times you've lost touch with reality. No one's going to believe you over me." The threat was empty because Marcus had no actual evidence of mental instability on my part. His entire narrative about my psychological condition had been fabricated. But the recording provided additional evidence of his intent to continue his campaign of psychological manipulation, even in the face of legal consequences. Marcus's legal defense was predictably based on trying to portray me as a mentally unstable ex-girlfriend seeking revenge for a failed relationship. His attorneys argued that my claims were the product of a delusional and obsessive fixation on our breakup, and that I was fabricating evidence to support false accusations. But the evidence against Marcus was too comprehensive and too well documented to be dismissed as the fantasies of a troubled woman. The recordings of him creating lies in real time, the testimony from multiple victims, the documentation of his systematic campaign against my professional reputation, it all painted a clear picture of deliberate, predatory behavior. The civil case was resolved first. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his defamatory statements and the clear damage they had caused to my career, Marcus's attorneys advised him to settle rather than risk a trial. The settlement included not only financial compensation for the professional damage he had caused, but also a comprehensive agreement that prohibited him from making any further statements about my mental health or professional competence. More importantly, the settlement included a requirement that Marcus provide written retractions of his false statements to everyone who had received them. He was required to contact each member of my department, each colleague who had received his fabricated reports about my mental health, and each friend who had been told lies about my psychological condition. He had to admit that his statements had been false and acknowledge that I had never exhibited the symptoms or behaviors he had described. The process of watching Marcus write those retractions was deeply satisfying in a way that surprised me. For years, he had positioned himself as the concerned partner dealing with an unstable girlfriend. Now he was required to admit, in writing, that he had been systematically lying about my mental health for his own psychological gratification. The criminal case took longer to resolve, but the outcome was equally satisfying. Marcus ultimately pled guilty to charges of criminal harassment and defamation. The plea agreement included a restraining order that prohibited him from contacting me or making any statements about me to third parties. He was also required to complete court-mandated therapy focused on his pattern of psychological abuse. But perhaps the most important outcome of the legal process was the creation of a documented record of Marcus's behavior. His pattern of targeting women in medical fields, systematically undermining their mental health and professional reputations, was now part of the public record. Future victims would have recourse to this documentation if they found themselves targeted by his manipulation. During the legal proceedings, I was introduced to Dr. Michael Torres, a forensic psychologist who specialized in treating victims of systematic psychological abuse. Dr. Torres helped me understand that the trauma I had experienced was real and measurable, even though it hadn't involved physical violence. Psychological abuse can be just as damaging as physical abuse, Dr. Torres explained. In some ways, it can be more damaging because it attacks your sense of reality and self-trust in ways that can take years to recover from. Dr. Torres helped me work through the complex process of rebuilding my confidence and professional identity after years of systematic manipulation. He helped me understand that the self-doubt and uncertainty I had experienced weren't character flaws, they were normal responses to abnormal circumstances. Marcus was essentially running a psychological warfare campaign against you, Dr. Torres said. The fact that you began to doubt your own perceptions doesn't mean you were weak or gullible. It means that his manipulation was sophisticated and sustained. Anyone subjected to that level of systematic gaslighting would experience similar effects. The therapy process was challenging, but ultimately transformative. I had to learn to trust my own perceptions again, to differentiate between legitimate self-reflection and the self-doubt that Marcus had instilled in me. I had to rebuild my professional confidence and repair relationships that had been damaged by his lies. But I also had to come to terms with the depth of the violation I had experienced. Marcus hadn't just lied about me, he had systematically attempted to destroy my sense of reality and my professional identity. He had weaponized my own profession against me, using the stigma surrounding mental health issues to isolate me and undermine my credibility. Dr. Torres helped me understand that healing from this type of abuse is a process, not an event. There would be days when I would doubt my own perceptions, when I would wonder if some of Marcus's assessments of my mental state had been accurate. But these moments of doubt were part of the recovery process, not evidence that his manipulation had been justified. Recovery from psychological abuse isn't linear, Dr. Torres told me. You're not going to wake up one day and suddenly trust yourself completely. But over time, as you practice trusting your own perceptions and as you see evidence that your judgments are sound, that confidence will rebuild. One of the most unexpected benefits of pursuing legal action against Marcus was the connections I made with other survivors of psychological abuse. Through Dr. Chen and Dr. Torres, I was introduced to a network of healthcare professionals who had experienced similar patterns of manipulation and gaslighting. These connections were invaluable in my recovery process. Speaking with other women who had endured systematic campaigns to undermine their mental health and professional reputations helped me understand that I wasn't alone, that my experience wasn't unique, and that recovery was possible. Many of these women had initially blamed themselves for their experiences, wondering if they had been too sensitive or too trusting in their relationships. But hearing their stories helped me understand that the problem wasn't with the victims. It was with predators like Marcus, who deliberately targeted successful, ambitious women and used sophisticated manipulation techniques to undermine their confidence and credibility. Dr. Jennifer Kim, an emergency medicine physician who had experienced a similar pattern of abuse, became a particularly important friend and ally during my recovery process. The hardest part for me was learning to trust my own clinical judgment again, Jennifer told me. My ex-husband had spent so much time convincing me that I was mentally unstable that I started second-guessing every medical decision I made. I was terrified that I really was as unreliable as he claimed. Jennifer's experience resonated deeply with my own struggles. Marcus's campaign against my mental health hadn't just affected my personal relationships. It had undermined my confidence as a physician and a researcher. I had started second-guessing my clinical judgments, wondering if my patients were safe in my care, questioning whether I was competent to practice medicine. But speaking with Jennifer and other survivors helped me understand that these doubts were the intended result of the abuse, not evidence that the abuse had been justified. Predators like Marcus deliberately target their victims' professional identities because they understand that undermining someone's confidence in their career can be one of the most effective ways to maintain control over them. The fact that you're questioning your own competence doesn't mean you're incompetent, Jennifer said. It means that someone deliberately made you question your competence as a way of controlling you. The two things are completely different. These conversations helped me begin to rebuild my professional confidence. I started to trust my clinical judgments again, to speak up in meetings, to pursue research opportunities that I had been too intimidated to consider during my relationship with Marcus. 6 months after the legal proceedings concluded, I was offered a fellowship position at one of the country's most prestigious psychiatric research institutes. The opportunity was everything I had hoped for when I entered medical school: a chance to conduct groundbreaking research on anxiety disorders while working with some of the most respected minds in the field. But perhaps more importantly, the offer represented a validation that my professional reputation had been restored. The false narrative that Marcus had spread about my mental health had been comprehensively debunked, and my colleagues now understood that I was a competent, stable physician whose only problem had been becoming involved with a manipulative predator. Dr. Patterson, who had been instrumental in helping me expose Marcus's lies, was thrilled when I shared the news about the fellowship. "This is exactly what should happen," she said. "You're one of the most talented residents I've ever worked with, and Marcus's lies should never have been allowed to derail your career. I'm so proud of you for fighting back and setting the record straight." The fellowship represented more than just a career opportunity. It represented freedom from the false narrative that Marcus had constructed about my life and my capabilities. For the first time in years, I was being evaluated based on my actual performance and potential rather than on fabricated stories about my mental health. But accepting the fellowship also meant making a decision about whether to share my story more broadly. The position would put me in the public eye to some extent, and I had to consider whether I wanted my experience with Marcus to become part of my professional narrative. After long discussions with Dr. Torres and Dr. Chen, I decided that sharing my story could be valuable for other potential victims of psychological abuse. Healthcare professionals are often targeted by manipulative partners precisely because their demanding careers make them vulnerable to isolation and self-doubt. By speaking openly about my experience, I could help other women recognize the warning signs of systematic psychological manipulation. I began speaking at medical conferences about the intersection of domestic abuse and healthcare careers. My presentations focused on the specific ways that psychological abusers target healthcare professionals, using their knowledge of medical terminology and diagnostic criteria to make their lies more convincing. Abusers who target healthcare professionals often weaponize our own training against us, I would tell audiences of medical students and residents. They use psychiatric terminology to pathologize normal emotional responses. They exploit our professional tendency towards self-reflection by convincing us that our doubts about their behavior are evidence of our own instability. The response to these presentations was overwhelmingly positive. Multiple women approached me after my talks to share their own experiences with partners who had used similar manipulation techniques. Many of them had never recognized that what they experienced was abuse because it hadn't involved physical violence. "I thought I was just in a difficult relationship," one resident told me after a presentation at her medical school. "I didn't realize that my boyfriend systematically telling people I was mentally unstable was actually a form of abuse. Your talk helped me understand that I don't have to accept his version of reality." These conversations reinforced my understanding that predators like Marcus are more common than many people realize, and that their tactics are sophisticated enough to fool even trained healthcare professionals. Sharing my story became a way of protecting other potential victims by helping them recognize the warning signs of systematic psychological manipulation. 2 years after the legal proceedings concluded, I received an unexpected call from Detective Sarah Martinez with the local police department. She was investigating a case involving Marcus and wondered if I would be willing to speak with her about my experiences. "We have a new victim," Detective Martinez explained. "A nurse practitioner named Rachel who's been involved with Marcus for about 8 months. She's reported that he's been spreading false information about her mental health to her colleagues and family members. When we ran his name through our system, your case came up." The call was both disturbing and validating. Disturbing because it meant that Marcus had found a new victim, despite the legal consequences he had faced. Validating because it confirmed that his behavior toward me hadn't been an isolated incident or a relationship gone wrong. It was part of a consistent pattern of predatory behavior. I agreed to speak with Detective Martinez and with Rachel, Marcus's new victim. Rachel's story was heartbreakingly familiar. Systematic gaslighting, fabricated stories about her mental health shared with her professional colleagues, and deliberate attempts to isolate her from her support systems. He's been telling people at my hospital that I'm having psychotic episodes, Rachel told me during our phone conversation. He described specific incidents that never happened, times when I supposedly couldn't tell the difference between reality and hallucinations. My supervisor called me in for a meeting about my concerning behavior based on things Marcus told them. Rachel had started to believe Marcus's narrative about her mental health, just as I had. She was questioning her own perceptions, wondering if she was really as unstable as he claimed, considering whether she should leave her job to focus on getting treatment for her supposed psychological problems. But unlike me, Rachel had the benefit of knowing about Marcus's history. The legal record from my case provided clear evidence that he had engaged in similar behavior with previous partners. Rachel didn't have to spend years documenting his lies and building a case from scratch. She could point to the established pattern of abuse and seek immediate legal protection. Detective Martinez was able to move quickly to obtain a restraining order protecting Rachel from further harassment. More importantly, the fact that Marcus was engaging in the same pattern of behavior so soon after facing legal consequences for similar conduct meant that he could face enhanced criminal charges for violating the terms of his previous plea agreement. This is why your case was so important, Detective Martinez told me. Having that legal precedent and documented pattern of behavior makes it much easier to protect future victims and hold him accountable for ongoing abuse. Marcus ultimately pled guilty to new charges of criminal harassment and violation of his plea agreement. The second conviction resulted in a longer sentence and more comprehensive restrictions on his behavior. Perhaps more importantly, it created an even stronger legal record that future victims could use to protect themselves. Rachel's case also led to additional victims coming forward. Once news of Marcus's arrest became public, 3 more women contacted the police to report similar experiences with him. The pattern was always the same: systematic gaslighting, fabricated stories about mental health shared with professional colleagues, and deliberate attempts to isolate victims from their support systems. He's a serial psychological abuser, Detective Martinez told me. He targets successful women in healthcare fields because he knows how to exploit their vulnerabilities and because he understands enough medical terminology to make his lies sound credible. The investigation into Marcus's pattern of abuse ultimately led to a comprehensive prosecution that addressed his behavior toward multiple victims. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to register as a domestic violence offender. The conviction and registration would make it more difficult for him to target future victims, as background checks would reveal his history of psychological abuse. 5 years after my first encounter with Marcus in that hospital parking garage, I found myself standing in a very different place, behind a podium at a national conference on domestic violence in healthcare settings. I was delivering the keynote address to an audience of physicians, nurses, social workers, and law enforcement professionals about the intersection of psychological abuse and medical careers. Psychological abuse is often invisible, I told the audience. There are no physical bruises, no emergency room visits, no obvious signs that something is wrong. But the damage is real and measurable when someone systematically undermines your sense of reality, when they weaponize your own profession against you, when they isolate you from support systems while positioning themselves as your savior. That's not a relationship problem. That's abuse. The presentation was part of a larger initiative I had helped to develop, a training program for healthcare institutions on recognizing and responding to psychological abuse among their staff. The program was designed to help supervisors and colleagues identify the warning signs of systematic manipulation and provide appropriate support to victims. Healthcare professionals are particularly vulnerable to certain types of psychological abuse, I explained. We're trained to be self-reflective, to question our own judgments, to seek consultation when we're uncertain. Predators exploit these professional strengths by convincing us that our doubts about their behavior are evidence of our own instability. The program had been implemented at dozens of hospitals and medical schools across the country. It included specific protocols for documenting suspected abuse, resources for victims seeking help, and guidelines for handling situations where abusers were spreading false information about their victims' mental health. Dr. Patricia Williams, the conference organizer, introduced me by noting that my case had led to significant changes in how the medical community understood and responded to psychological abuse. Dr. Sarah Thompson's experience exposed a gap in our understanding of domestic violence, Dr. Williams said. We had protocols for physical abuse, but we didn't have adequate resources for healthcare workers experiencing systematic psychological manipulation. Her advocacy has led to policy changes that have protected countless other victims. The recognition was gratifying, but what meant more to me were the individual stories of women who had been helped by the resources and awareness that had grown out of my experience. I regularly received emails and phone calls from healthcare workers who had recognized the signs of psychological abuse in their own relationships and sought help before the damage became as extensive as what I had experienced. "Your presentation probably saved my career," one resident wrote to me. "My boyfriend had been doing exactly what you described, telling my colleagues that I was mentally unstable, creating false stories about my behavior, positioning himself as my concerned caregiver. But because I'd heard your talk, I recognized what was happening before I started to believe his narrative about my mental health." These success stories reinforced my understanding that sharing my experience, despite the personal cost of reliving traumatic memories, was worthwhile if it helped other women avoid similar abuse. The most unexpected development in my recovery journey was meeting Dr. James Chen, no relation to Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma researcher who had attended one of my presentations about psychological abuse in healthcare settings. James approached me after my talk to share his own research on the long-term effects of gaslighting and systematic psychological manipulation. "Your case is actually quite significant from a research perspective," James told me over coffee after the conference. "The level of documentation you maintained during the abuse and the comprehensive legal record that resulted provides a unique window into how systematic gaslighting operates and how victims can recover from it." James was conducting a longitudinal study on recovery from psychological abuse, and he invited me to participate as both a research subject and a collaborator. The study was designed to understand the specific mechanisms by which victims of systematic gaslighting rebuild their sense of reality and professional confidence. "Most research on psychological abuse focuses on the immediate effects," James explained, "but we don't have good data on the recovery process, how people learn to trust their own perceptions again, how they rebuild professional confidence, how they develop resilience against future manipulation." Participating in the research was initially challenging because it required me to examine my own recovery process with clinical objectivity. But it was also deeply validating to contribute to scientific understanding of psychological abuse and recovery. The research confirmed what Dr. Torres had told me about the non-linear nature of recovery from psychological abuse. Even years after my experience with Marcus, I still had occasional moments of self-doubt, times when I would question my own perceptions or worry that my emotional reactions were excessive. But the research also documented the positive aspects of my recovery. My scores on measures of professional confidence and self-efficacy had not only returned to baseline levels, but had actually exceeded them. The experience of successfully fighting back against Marcus's campaign of lies had given me a deep confidence in my ability to trust my own judgments and advocate for myself. "You've developed what we call psychological resilience," James explained. "People who successfully recover from systematic gaslighting often become more confident in their own perceptions than they were before the abuse occurred. They've had to learn to trust themselves in the face of sustained psychological pressure, and that skill generalizes to other areas of their lives." Working with James on the research also led to a romantic relationship that developed slowly and naturally over several months of collaboration. Unlike my relationship with Marcus, which had been intense and overwhelming from the beginning, my relationship with James was built on mutual respect, shared intellectual interests, and careful attention to healthy communication patterns. "I want you to feel completely safe questioning anything I say or do," James told me early in our relationship. "After what you've been through, I understand that trust has to be rebuilt gradually and that you need to feel free to voice any concerns without being dismissed or minimized." James's approach to our relationship was everything that Marcus's had not been. He encouraged my professional ambitions rather than undermining them. He celebrated my achievements rather than suggesting they were evidence of mental instability. He respected my autonomy rather than trying to position himself as my caretaker or protector. Most importantly, James understood that my experience with Marcus was a significant part of my history, but not the defining feature of my identity. He supported my advocacy work without making it the center of our relationship. He listened to my stories about the abuse without trying to fix me or treat me as damaged. "You're not broken," he told me during one conversation about my ongoing recovery process. "You survived something terrible and you fought back successfully. That doesn't make you damaged. It makes you strong." Said 7 years after that moment on the courthouse steps when I watched Marcus emerge from his legal proceedings looking shocked and defeated, I found myself in a position I could never have imagined during the darkest days of our relationship. I was the director of a research institute focused on psychological abuse and trauma recovery. The institute, which had grown out of my collaboration with James and other researchers, was conducting groundbreaking studies on the neurological effects of gaslighting, the recovery process for victims of systematic psychological manipulation, and the development of prevention programs for high-risk populations. The work was deeply fulfilling because it transformed my personal experience of abuse into a platform for helping others and advancing scientific understanding of psychological trauma. Every study we published, every training program we developed, every victim we helped represented a victory over the type of manipulation that Marcus had tried to use to destroy my life. But perhaps more importantly, I had built a life that was completely free from the false narrative that Marcus had tried to impose on me. I was respected in my field for my research and advocacy work. I had healthy relationships with colleagues who valued my contributions and trusted my professional judgment. I was in a loving partnership with someone who supported my autonomy and celebrated my achievements. The contrast with the isolated, self-doubting woman I had become during my relationship with Marcus was profound. The confident, capable person I was now felt like a return to my authentic self, the person I had been before Marcus's systematic campaign to undermine my sense of reality. I still thought about Marcus occasionally, particularly when working with new victims of psychological abuse who were experiencing the same patterns of manipulation I had endured. But those thoughts no longer carried the weight of trauma or self-doubt. Instead, they reinforced my understanding of how far I had come and how completely I had recovered from his attempts to destroy my mental health and professional identity. Detective Martinez had contacted me periodically over the years to update me on Marcus's situation. He had served his full prison sentence and been released with strict conditions, requiring him to stay away from healthcare facilities and undergo continued psychological treatment. There had been no reports of new victims since his release, though Martinez cautioned that his pattern of behavior was unlikely to have changed permanently. "People like Marcus don't usually change," she told me during our most recent conversation. "They might modify their tactics or become more careful about avoiding legal consequences, but the underlying psychology that drives their behavior rarely changes significantly." The knowledge that Marcus was still out there, potentially targeting new victims, was disturbing but no longer frightening. I had proven that his manipulation tactics could be exposed and defeated. I had demonstrated that victims of systematic psychological abuse could not only recover, but thrive. And I had built systems and resources that would make it easier for future victims to protect themselves and seek justice. The restraining order that had been issued as part of Marcus's original conviction was permanent, meaning he was legally prohibited from contacting me or making any statements about me for the rest of his life. Violating that order would result in immediate criminal charges and additional prison time, but more importantly, I no longer felt vulnerable to his manipulation. The psychological warfare techniques that had once seemed so sophisticated and convincing now appeared transparent and predictable. The man who had once made me question my own sanity now seemed like exactly what he was: a pathetic predator who targeted successful women because he was threatened by their achievements and needed to destroy them in order to feel powerful. The final chapter of my story with Marcus came in an unexpected form. 8 years after our last contact, I received a letter forwarded through my attorney. Marcus had written to me from a halfway house where he was living as part of his probation requirements. The letter was not an apology, though it was framed as one. Instead, it was a final attempt at manipulation, designed to make me feel sorry for him and question whether I had been too harsh in pursuing legal consequences for his behavior. "I know I made mistakes in our relationship," the letter began. "I was dealing with my own mental health issues at the time, and I didn't handle things well. I never meant to hurt you, and I'm sorry if my actions caused you pain." the language was carefully chosen to minimize his responsibility while portraying himself as a victim of his own psychological problems. He wasn't acknowledging that he had systematically lied about my mental health or that he had deliberately tried to destroy my professional reputation. He was simply admitting to mistakes and suggesting that his behavior had been the result of his own mental health struggles. The letter went on to describe his current situation in terms designed to evoke sympathy. He was struggling financially, having difficulty finding employment, and dealing with the stigma of his conviction for domestic violence. He was attending court-mandated therapy but found it challenging because the therapist didn't understand the complexity of his situation. "I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me," the letter concluded. "I know I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I've learned from my mistakes and I'm trying to become a better person." Reading the letter, I felt nothing but cold clarity. Every word was calculated to manipulate, to make me doubt the severity of his abuse, to position him as a reformed man who deserved my forgiveness and understanding. Even from a halfway house, even after years of legal consequences and mandated therapy, Marcus was still trying to manipulate me. I showed the letter to Dr. Torres, who had continued to work with me occasionally on research projects related to psychological abuse recovery. "This is exactly what we would expect from someone with his psychological profile," Dr. Torres said after reading the letter. "He's not capable of genuine remorse because he doesn't believe he did anything wrong. In his mind, you were the problem. You were mentally unstable, you overreacted to his help, you vindictively pursued legal action against a man who was trying to care for you." Dr. Torres explained that the letter was actually a positive sign in terms of my recovery, because it demonstrated how completely immune I had become to Marcus's manipulation tactics. "5 years ago, this letter might have made you question whether you had been too harsh in prosecuting him," Dr. Torres said. "Now you can read it and immediately recognize it as manipulation. That's a profound measure of your psychological recovery." I didn't respond to the letter. Instead, I forwarded it to Detective Martinez and to my attorney as documentation of Marcus's continued attempts to manipulate me despite the restraining order. While the letter didn't technically violate the order, it hadn't been sent directly to me and didn't contain explicit threats. It provided additional evidence of his ongoing psychological dysfunction. More importantly, receiving the letter reinforced my understanding of how completely I had recovered from his abuse. The man who had once made me question my own sanity now seemed transparent and pathetic. His attempts at manipulation were so obvious, so predictable, that they had no emotional impact on me whatsoever. 10 years after I first met Marcus at that medical conference, I was invited to deliver a TED Talk about psychological abuse and recovery. The invitation came as a result of the Research Institute's work and the training programs we had developed for healthcare institutions. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of hundreds of people, I thought about the woman I had been during my relationship with Marcus. Isolated, self-doubting, convinced that she was mentally unstable and professionally incompetent. That woman would never have imagined she could stand confidently in front of such an audience, sharing her story and her insights about psychological trauma and recovery. "Psychological abuse works by convincing you that your perceptions are flawed," I told the audience. "It makes you doubt your own reality, question your own competence, and become dependent on your abuser's version of truth. But the human capacity for recovery is remarkable. When we rebuild our ability to trust our own perceptions, when we reconnect with supportive communities, when we refuse to accept someone else's false narrative about our capabilities, we don't just survive, we thrive." The talk was viewed by millions of people around the world and led to an even broader platform for discussing psychological abuse and recovery. I received thousands of messages from women who recognized their own experiences in my story, from healthcare professionals who wanted to implement our training programs, and from researchers interested in collaborating on studies of psychological manipulation and trauma recovery. But the most meaningful response came from a young medical student named Emma, who attended a conference where I was speaking and approached me afterward. "I think my boyfriend has been doing some of the things you described," she said quietly. "He's been telling people in my program that I'm struggling with anxiety and depression, but I don't think I am. He says he's worried about me, but after hearing your talk, I'm starting to wonder if he's actually the problem." Emma's situation was still in the early stages, which meant that intervention could prevent the extensive damage that had been done in my case. We connected her with resources for documenting her boyfriend's behavior, obtaining legal protection, and accessing counseling support. 6 months later, Emma contacted me to let me know that she had ended the relationship and successfully exposed her ex boyfriend's lies to her medical school faculty. Unlike my experience, where the damage to my reputation had taken years to repair, Emma's quick action had prevented any lasting professional consequences. Your story gave me the language to understand what was happening to me, Emma wrote. I didn't have to spend years questioning my own sanity because you had already shown that this pattern of behavior exists and that it's not the victim's fault. And interactions like this one reinforced my understanding that sharing my story, despite the personal cost, was having a meaningful impact on other women's lives. Every person who recognized the signs of psychological abuse early, every victim who sought help before the damage became extensive, every woman who refused to accept a false narrative about her mental health, they all represented victories over the type of manipulation that predators like Marcus use to control and destroy their victims. Today, as I write this account of my experience with Marcus and my journey to recovery, I am acutely aware of how completely my life has been transformed. The research institute I direct has become nationally recognized for its work on psychological abuse and trauma recovery. The training programs we've developed are used in healthcare institutions across the country. The legal precedents set by my case have helped dozens of other victims seek justice for similar abuse. But beyond the professional achievements, I have built a life that is everything Marcus tried to convince me I was incapable of having. I am in a healthy, supportive marriage with James, who continues to respect my autonomy and celebrate my achievements. I have strong professional relationships with colleagues who value my expertise and trust my judgment. I have a clear sense of my own capabilities and limitations, free from the distorted narrative that Marcus tried to impose on me. Most importantly, I have absolute confidence in my own perceptions and my ability to distinguish between reality and manipulation. The skills I developed in fighting back against Marcus's gaslighting campaign, careful documentation, systematic analysis of evidence, insistence on objective verification of claims, have served me well in all areas of my life. I still encounter people occasionally who remember the false narrative that Marcus spread about my mental health. But those encounters no longer cause me distress because I have comprehensive evidence of the truth and a community of colleagues who understand what really happened. The lies that once seemed so powerful and credible now appear exactly as they are. The desperate fabrications of a man who was threatened by my success and tried to destroy me rather than face his own inadequacies. The woman who stood on those courthouse steps 10 years ago, watching Marcus emerge from his legal proceedings with shock and disbelief, could not have imagined the life I live today. She was still healing, still rebuilding her sense of reality, still fighting to reclaim her professional identity from the wreckage of his manipulation campaign. But that woman was also stronger than she knew. She had survived systematic psychological warfare. She had documented comprehensive evidence of elaborate deception. She had fought back against a predator who had tried to destroy her mind and her career. And in doing so, she had not only saved herself, she had created resources and precedents that would protect countless other women from similar abuse. Marcus told everyone I was crazy. He was wrong. I silently exposed his lies methodically and completely. I watched him fall, not with malice, but with the cold satisfaction that comes from seeing justice done and truth revealed. And in the end, his attempts to destroy me only made me stronger, more confident, and more determined to help other women recognize and resist psychological manipulation. The courthouse steps were just the beginning of my real life, the life I built after refusing to accept someone else's false narrative about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. That life has been more successful, more fulfilling, and more authentic than anything I could have imagined when I was trapped in Marcus's web of lies and manipulation. He told everyone I was crazy. Instead, I proved everyone exactly who he really was. And I've spent every day since then building a life that stands as testimony to the power of truth, the possibility of recovery, and the strength that comes from refusing to be defined by someone else's lies. The end of my story with Marcus was really the beginning of my story as myself, clear-eyed, confident, and completely free from the false narrative he had tried to impose on my life. That freedom, hard-won and carefully protected, remains the foundation of everything I've built since.